The chains were a dull, rusted iron, heavy with the weight of judgment. They bound the man's wrists and ankles, forcing him into a shuffling, broken gait that was an insult to the powerful frame they restrained. He was brought into the center of the settlement, a place that called itself a town, but was little more than a collection of wooden buildings clinging to the edge of a vast, unforgiving wilderness. The dust of the street rose in fine, choking clouds around him. His head was bowed, a curtain of long, dark hair obscuring his face. He was caked in mud and dried blood, but it was his silence that was most unnerving. He did not grunt or cry out. He absorbed the jeers and the stones cast by children with a stillness that was both profound and unsettling. Elias Thorne, the man who owned the land, the store, and the fear of everyone in town, stood on the porch of the saloon, his thumbs hooked into his waistcoat. This is what happens to savages who trespass on decent folks' land. He boomed, his voice oiled with self-importance. Caught him in my traps, up in the northern ridge. A poacher and a thief. A woman, standing apart from the crowd, watched the scene unfold. Her name was Seraphina, and she was an outcast, branded by a past that was not her own. She was the daughter of a failed prospector, left with a worthless claim and a name whispered with a mixture of pity and scorn. She lived on a small, rock-strewn homestead that the town had long since written off as barren. Her hands were calloused from working the unforgiving soil, her face etched with a quiet resilience. She looked at the man in chains, and she did not see a savage. She saw the same wilderness in him that she saw in the mirror every morning, a spirit that refused to be tamed, a sorrow that ran deeper than words. She saw the way his shoulders, though slumped in submission, held a latent strength. She saw the way the wind moved through his hair, as if it recognized one of its own. She had to do something. It was an impulse that came from the very core of her being, a deep, resonant chord of justice that refused to be silenced. She took a step forward, then another, the crowd parting before her with surprised murmurs. She stopped before Thorne, her small stature a stark contrast to his imposing bulk. Her voice was low, yet it carried over the hush that had fallen. "Unchain him." Thorne laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Go back to your rocks, Fina. This doesn't concern you." She lifted her chin, her eyes, the color of a stormy sky, meeting his without a tremor of fear. "He was on my claim. The northern ridge belongs to the old Miller deed. It belongs to me." A gasp rippled through the onlookers. Thorne's face darkened. "That land is worthless." "Perhaps," she said, "but it is mine. And any debt he owes for trespassing, he owes to me. Unchain him now. I'll bear his shackles. Give him to me as a bonded man until his debt is paid." The audacity of her proposal left the crowd speechless. Thorne stared at her, a vein pulsing in his temple. He saw the challenge in her eyes, but he also saw an opportunity. He could humiliate her, break her spirit by saddling her with this wild man. He could watch her fail, and then her worthless, rocky land would be his for the taking. A slow, cruel smile spread across his face. "Fine," he spat. "He's your problem now. Call him savage all you want. I see a man worth standing beside." She had not realized she'd spoken the last words aloud until she heard them echo in the sudden, absolute silence of the town square. The journey to her homestead was made in a silence broken only by the whisper of the wind through the tall, dry grass and the clink of the chains still binding the man's wrists. He walked behind her, his steps measured and surprisingly light for a man in irons. He did not look at her. His gaze was fixed on the horizon, a distant, unknowable expression on his face. Her farm was not much more than a shack, a testament to years of stubborn struggle against an unforgiving land. The cabin was small, the wood weathered gray by sun and wind. A stone fence, painstakingly built by her own hands, marked the boundary of a small vegetable patch. A lone goat watched their approach with intelligent, indifferent eyes. She led him not to the house, but to the small, sturdy barn. Inside, the air smelled of hay and dust and solitude. She pointed to a pile of clean straw in an empty stall. "You can sleep here." He gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. His eyes, she now saw, were a deep, startling green, like moss in a shaded forest. They held no fear, no anger, only a profound and weary watchfulness. She left and returned a moment later with a bowl of water and a piece of hard-tack bread. She set it on a crate near the stall. He watched her, his expression unreadable. She hesitated, then pulled a small, heavy key from her pocket. She approached him slowly, as one would approach a wild, cornered animal. "Hold still," she said softly. He did not flinch as she unlocked the iron cuffs. They fell from his wrists with a heavy thud, leaving angry red welts on his skin. He flexed his fingers, his gaze dropping to his freed hands as if they were unfamiliar to him. For the first time, he looked directly at her. His voice, when he finally spoke, was a low, rough sound, like stones grinding together. "Why?" She met his gaze, her own expression unyielding. "I don't hold with putting a man in a cage." She turned to leave, her heart pounding a strange, unsteady rhythm against her ribs. She had brought a storm into her quiet, lonely world. Standing in the doorway of the barn, she paused and looked back at him. He had not touched the food or water. He was simply standing in the center of the stall, his freed hands hanging at his sides, watching her with those wild green eyes. She had offered him a sliver of trust in a world that had shown him none. Now, all she could do was wait and see if that trust would be rewarded, or if it would be the cause of her ruin. The first test came 3 days later. A sudden, unseasonable blizzard swept down from the mountains, a howling vortex of wind and blinding snow that descended with shocking speed. Seraphina had been caught out, trying to secure the goat in its pen, when the full force of the storm hit. The wind was a physical blow, stealing her breath and driving the ice-like snow into her skin. She stumbled, her vision obscured, the few yards back to the cabin becoming a treacherous, impossible journey. She fell, her knees striking a half-buried rock with a sharp, sickening crack of pain. She tried to rise, but a wave of nausea and agony washed over her. The cold was already seeping into her bones, a deadly, numbing lethargy. This is how it ends, she thought, not with a bang, but with a whisper of wind and a blanket of white. Then a shape materialized out of the swirling snow. It was him. He had no coat, only his thin shirt, but he moved through the blizzard with an unnerving purpose, as if the storm were an old, familiar adversary. He reached her side and knelt, his face a mask of grim concentration. Without a word, he tore a strip of cloth from the bottom of his own shirt, and with surprising gentleness wrapped it tightly around her bleeding knee. The pain was immense, but his touch was steady and sure. He then scooped her into his arms, as if she weighed nothing. The shock of his strength, of his closeness, was as stunning as the cold. He smelled of wood smoke and winter air. She could feel the solid, steady beat of his heart against her ear. He did not struggle against the storm. He seemed to bend with it, finding the path through the blinding whiteness by some instinct she could not fathom. He carried her into the cabin and deposited her gently onto the small cot by the hearth. The world was a blur of pain and cold, but she was aware of his constant, efficient motion. He stoked the dying embers in the fireplace, bringing them back to roaring life. He fetched water, his movements economical and silent. He examined her knee, his touch impersonal yet careful, and packed it with a poultice of herbs he found in her own drying rack, herbs she had not realized could be used for such a purpose. He worked with a quiet, focused intensity, his presence filling the small cabin, pushing back the fury of the storm outside. Hours later, the blizzard still raged, but inside the cabin, there was a fragile pocket of warmth and safety. Seraphina lay propped against the wall, her leg throbbing but bandaged, a cup of hot, bitter tea in her hands. He sat on the floor across the room, staring into the flames, his profile carved from shadow and light. He had saved her life. He had done it without a word, without being asked. In the heart of the storm, in the crucible of a shared crisis, a silent understanding had been forged. He was not a savage. He was a survivor. And for the first time since she had brought him to her farm, she allowed herself to believe that she was not alone. The blizzard broke, leaving behind a world of pristine, treacherous beauty. When the path was clear, Seraphina limped into town for supplies, her need for salt and flour overriding her desire to avoid the town's venomous stares. The reception was colder than the snow. Thorne had been busy. Whispers followed her from the moment she set foot on the boardwalk. "She's bedding a savage. Mark my words, he'll kill her in her sleep." Thorne was right to chain him. At the mercantile, Mr. Henderson refused to even look at her. "No credit, Fina," he said, busying himself by rearranging tins on a shelf. Thorne's called in all his notes. "Says the town needs to be financially secure." The message was clear. She was being starved out, her small act of defiance being punished by the slow, inexorable squeeze of isolation. She turned to leave, her basket empty, her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest. As she stepped outside, she saw Thorne standing across the street, watching her, a smug, satisfied smirk on his face. He lifted his hat in a gesture of mock courtesy. The humiliation was a physical thing, a hot flush that spread across her cheeks. Defeated, she began the long, painful walk home. The snow-covered landscape felt vast and empty, a reflection of the hollowness inside her. But as her small farm came into view, she saw something that made her stop. A thin plume of smoke was rising not from the cabin's chimney, but from a spot near the base of the rocky ridge that bordered her land. It was him. He was working. He had found the old, abandoned forge her father had built years ago, a relic of his failed dreams. He had somehow managed to clear it of snow, repair the bellows, and get a fire burning hot and bright. As she drew closer, she could hear the rhythmic, metallic ring of a hammer striking an anvil. He was stripped to the waist, despite the cold, his back a landscape of corded muscle and old, faded scars. He was taking the rusted, broken pieces of an old plow she had left for scrap, and was painstakingly reforging the blade, his movements precise and powerful. He was not just mending a tool. He was creating something useful from something broken. He was breathing life back into the dead iron of her father's failures. He looked up as she approached, his eyes immediately taking in her empty basket, the weary slump of her shoulders. He didn't have to ask. He knew. He stopped his work, the hammer falling silent. He wiped the sweat from his brow with the back of his arm, leaving a smudge of soot. He looked at her, then at the half-finished plow blade glowing on the anvil, then back at her. In the space of that silent glance, a message was passed. The town could turn its back. The world could try to starve them. But here, on this small patch of unwanted land, they would forge their own survival. The ringing of the hammer, when it began again, was no longer just the sound of a tool being mended. It was a sound of defiance. It was the sound of a future being built, one strike at a time. The nights were long and cold, the silence of the snow-covered world, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the howl of the wind. It was in these quiet hours that the ghosts of the past seemed to gather. Seraphina would often wake in the dead of night, her heart pounding, the memory of her father's final desperate days, of vivid, suffocating presence. She would see his face, hollowed by failure, and hear the whispers of the townsfolk who had called him a fool. She would lie on her cot, wrapped in a cold sweat, feeling the weight of his legacy like a shroud. From the barn, she would sometimes hear a single sharp cry, quickly stifled. She knew he was out there, wrestling with his own demons in the dark. They were two haunted souls, living side by side, their unspoken traumas a constant, invisible presence in the space between them. One evening, as she was banking the fire for the night, she noticed him standing in the doorway of the barn, watching her. He held something in his hand. He walked into the cabin, the first time he had done so, without a direct invitation, and held it out to her. It was a small, intricately carved wolf, fashioned from a piece of weathered pine. Its head was thrown back in a silent howl, its form so lifelike she could almost feel the tension in its wooden muscles. She took it from him, her fingers brushing against his. His skin was rough and calloused, but there was a warmth to it that seemed to seep into her own. "It's beautiful," she whispered, her voice thick with an emotion she couldn't name. He didn't reply. His gaze drifted to a series of marks carved into the cabin's mantelpiece. They were simple slashes, a crude calendar she had kept since she was a child. "Each mark is a winter," she found herself explaining, her voice quiet. "My father made the first one. I've made the rest." He reached out and traced one of the marks with his finger, his touch surprisingly gentle. "He fought the land," the man said, his voice a low rumble. It wasn't a question. "He tried to break it," she confirmed, her own voice barely a whisper. "He dug for gold until his hands bled. He thought there was a treasure buried under all these rocks. He never saw the treasure that was right here." Her gesture encompassed the small, sturdy cabin, the view of the snow-dusted mountains, the quiet solitude. He looked at her, his green eyes searching her face. "You see it," he stated. She nodded, her throat tight. "This land doesn't need to be broken. It just needs to be understood." He looked down at the carving in her hand, then back at her. A silent communication passed between them, an acknowledgement of their shared philosophy. They were not conquerors. They were survivors, people who understood that strength did not come from breaking the world to your will, but from finding your place within it. He gave a single, slow nod, then turned and walked back to the barn, leaving her standing in the warm glow of the firelight, the small wooden wolf clutched in her hand. It was not just a gift. It was a story. It was a piece of his own wild, unbroken soul. The spring thaw came slowly, tentatively, the snow receding to reveal the damp, sleeping earth beneath. With the melting of the snow came a new kind of threat. One afternoon, as Seraphina was clearing a channel to drain the meltwater from her field, Thorne and two of his hired men rode up to her fence line. Thorne stayed on his horse, looking down at her with an expression of smug ownership. "The thaws revealed your father's old claim markers, Fina," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "My surveyor tells me this little patch of green you're cultivating is actually on my side of the line." Seraphine's blood ran cold. It was a lie, and they both knew it. Her father's deed was old, the boundaries marked by rocks and trees, not by precise lines on a map. Thorne was manufacturing a dispute, creating a pretext to seize her land. "You know that's not true, Elias." "My map says it is," he countered, holding up a rolled piece of parchment. "The law is on my side. I'll give you till the end of the week to clear out." One of his men dismounted, a cruel sneer on his face. He walked over to the newly reforged plow that was resting near the fence and gave it a hard kick, sending it clattering to the ground. "Nice piece of scrap," he laughed. Before Seraphina could even react, a shadow fell over the man. It was him, Kael. He had come from the forge, silent as a wolf. He didn't have a weapon. He didn't need one. He simply stood there, his large frame blocking the sun, his green eyes fixed on the man who had kicked the plow. He didn't speak. He didn't even clench his fists. He just stood. There was an aura of absolute stillness about him, an unshakable sense of rootedness, as if he were a part of the mountain itself. The hired man, who had been full of bluster a moment before, seemed to shrink. He took an involuntary step back, his sneer faltering. He looked to Thorne for support, But Thorne too seemed momentarily thrown by the silent, immovable man who had appeared from nowhere. Kael then shifted his gaze to Thorne, holding it for a long, silent moment. In that look was a promise, a warning far more potent than any spoken threat. It said, "This land is protected. She is protected." The silence stretched, thick and heavy. Finally, Thorne broke it, his voice lacking its earlier confidence. "This isn't over," he snapped, pulling on his horse's reins. He and his men rode off, their retreat a stark contrast to their arrogant arrival. Kael stood watching until they were gone. He then bent down, picked up the plow, and carefully set it upright. He ran a hand over the smooth, dark metal of the blade he had forged. He turned to Seraphina, his expression unreadable, and then, without a word, walked back towards the forge. She stood frozen, her heart hammering against her ribs. He hadn't fought for her with his fists. He had fought for her with his presence. He had drawn a line in the dirt, not with a weapon, but with the sheer force of his own integrity. And in that moment, she understood that the rickety stone fence she had built was no longer the only thing keeping the world at bay. The rhythm of their lives settled into a new pattern, one of shared purpose and comfortable silence. They worked from sunrise to sunset, bringing the stubborn land to life. With the reforged plow, they turned the soil of a new field, their movements synchronized, a silent ballet of labor. He would drive the plow, his powerful shoulders straining, and she would follow behind, breaking up the clods of earth, her hands sinking into the cool, dark soil. They were planting a future, seed by seed. In the evenings, they would often sit on the porch of the small cabin, watching the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. The silence between them was no longer the cautious silence of strangers, but the deep, restful silence of two people who understood each other on a level that transcended words. One evening, as they sat watching the twilight deepen, he was carving another piece of wood. She noticed a long, puckered scar on his forearm, a mark that was clearly not from battle, but from something else. It was the shape of a brand. She looked at it, her curiosity warring with her reluctance to pry into his past. He must have felt her gaze, because his hand stilled. He looked down at the scar, his expression hardening for a brief moment. He then seemed to come to a decision. He turned his arm, exposing the mark more fully to the fading light. "It means unclaimed," he said, his voice a low whisper. "Property of the company that ran the mines I was forced to work in. When a man's contract was up, or he ran, he was marked. So no one else would hire him. So he would be an outcast forever." The story was delivered in flat, emotionless tones, but Seraphina could feel the years of pain and injustice simmering beneath the surface. This was the source of his silence, of his watchfulness. He had been literally branded an outsider, a man belonging to no one. "My tribe's land was on a river of gold," he continued, his eyes fixed on the distant mountains. "They came for the gold. They took the land. They took the men for the mines. They left us with nothing." She reached out, her hand hovering for a moment before she gently placed it over the scar. It was an impulsive gesture, an immediate need to cover the mark, to erase the symbol of his dehumanization. "You are not unclaimed," she said, her voice fierce and quiet. He looked at her, his green eyes wide with a raw, unguarded vulnerability she had never seen before. Her touch was not one of pity, but of acceptance. She was not trying to heal his past, but to acknowledge it, to share its weight. In that moment, beneath the vast, star-dusted sky, something shifted between them. The slow, patient burn of respect and companionship had finally kindled into a flame. It was a terrifying, beautiful, and undeniable warmth that spread from their joined hands and filled the vast, empty spaces in both of their hearts. A few weeks later, a lone rider approached the farm. He was not one of Thorne's men. He was an older man, his face weathered like a river stone, and he rode with the straight-backed posture of a soldier. He introduced himself as Marcus, and he asked for the man who lived in the barn. When Kael appeared, the two men stood for a long moment in silence, a complex history passing between them in a single shared glance. Marcus had been the captain of a company of army scouts. Kael, he explained later to a stunned Seraphina, had been his best. They called him Wind That Speaks, Marcus said, his voice full of a deep, old respect. He could read the land like a book. He knew the paths no one else knew. We were mapping the territories west of the mountains. He paused, his expression growing grim. Then we found Thorne's mining operation. It wasn't a mine. It was a slave camp. He was using treaty landers, men who were supposed to be protected by the government, and working them to death. Kael, he was one of them. He had been captured in a raid years before, his history erased. I didn't know who he was, only what he could do. Marcus explained that Kael had led a rebellion, freeing the men who were being held captive. In the ensuing chaos, Thorne had escaped, branding Kael a murderer and a savage, putting a bounty on his head that had forced him to live as a fugitive ever since. I've been tracking Thorne for 2 years, Marcus said, his eyes hard as flint. And I've been looking for you, Kael. The territorial government has issued a warrant for Thorne's arrest. Your name has been cleared. You're a free man. Kael listened to all of this with his characteristic stillness, but Seraphina could see the subtle tremor in his hands, the flicker of a profound, earth-shattering emotion in his eyes. The brand on his arm suddenly seemed less like a scar and more like a testament to his fight for freedom. He was not a savage, not a criminal, not an outcast. He was a hero, a liberator. As Marcus spoke, they saw a cloud of dust on the horizon, moving fast towards the farm. It was Thorne, and he was not coming alone. He had seen Marcus ride out from town, had likely guessed the purpose of his visit. He was coming to silence the truth, once and for all. Kael looked at Marcus, then at Seraphina. He had spent years running, but now, standing on the land he had helped bring back to life, beside the woman who had seen his worth when no one else had, he knew the running was over. We make our stand here, Kael said, his voice clear and strong. It was not a question. It was a declaration. Thorne and a dozen of his hired guns rode onto the property, their faces set in grim, determined lines. They were not a mob this time. They were a private army, come to extinguish a threat. Kael, Thorne shouted, his voice ringing with false authority. You're a wanted fugitive. I'm here to take you in, dead or alive. From the porch of the cabin, Marcus stepped into view, his old army coat making him an unmistakable figure. Your warrant is 2 years out of date, Thorne, but mine is fresh. Elias Thorne, you are under arrest for illegal imprisonment, slave labor, and fraud. Thorne laughed, a wild, unhinged sound. Your jurisdiction ends where my property begins, old man. This is my town. My law. He raised his rifle, a signal to his men. But before a shot could be fired, Kael stepped out from the barn. He was not armed with a gun. In his hand, he held a single, perfectly balanced throwing axe. He did not look at Thorne. He looked at the men behind him, the hired guns, the townsfolk Thorne had paid or intimidated into riding with him. He held up his arm, showing them the brand. This is Thorne's law. He called out, his voice resonating with a power no one had heard from him before. This is the mark he gives to men whose land he steals, whose families he destroys. Look at it. Is this the law you want for yourselves? For your children? Seraphina came to stand on the porch, her own rifle held loosely in her hands. She stood beside Marcus, a small, unshakable point of defiance. She did not speak. Her presence at his side was her statement. Thorne's men hesitated. They were hired guns, but they were also men who understood the brutal realities of the frontier. They saw the brand on Kael's arm. They heard the truth in his voice. and they saw the unwavering loyalty of the woman and the soldier who stood with him. They began to lower their rifles, one by one. Thorne, seeing his authority evaporate, let out a roar of pure rage and fired his rifle wildly towards Kael. But Kael was no longer there. He moved with a speed that was almost supernatural, a blur of motion. The throwing axe left his hand, a spinning arc of dark metal against the sky. It did not strike Thorne. It struck the rifle in his hands, shattering the stock and sending the gun flying from his grasp. Kael was on him in an instant, not with a weapon, but with the sheer force of his body, tackling him from his horse and into the dust. The fight was over began. Thorne, disarmed and humiliated, was no longer a tyrant. He was just a man, sputtering and defeated in the dirt. In the aftermath, justice was swift. Marcus took Thorne into custody, the town's fealty to their fallen leader dissolving as quickly as a morning mist. The men who had ridden with him quietly disappeared, their bravado gone, replaced by a sullen shame. The town began to look at Seraphine's small farm not with scorn, but with a new, grudging respect. It had become a place of reckoning, a place where the truth had finally found its voice. A few days later, Marcus prepared to leave, Thorne securely tied to a spare horse. He offered Kael a place with him, a new life as a government agent, a chance to help build a better, more just territory. "You have a gift, Kael," Marcus said, "a way of speaking the truth that makes men listen." Kael looked at the fields they had plowed, at the sturdy cabin, at Seraphina, who stood on the porch, watching them. He had been a voice for the voiceless, a protector for the vulnerable. He had fought his battle. Now he wanted to build a life. "My truth is here now," he said, his voice quiet but firm. Marcus nodded, understanding. He tipped his hat to Seraphina. "You've got a good man, Nam. You saw the gold in him when everyone else just saw the rock." With that, he rode away, leaving the two of them in the quiet peace of the morning. Kael walked over to Seraphina on the porch. The world felt new, washed clean. The future, which had always been a thing to be survived, now felt like a thing to be built. She looked at the brand on his arm, no longer a symbol of shame, but a mark of his incredible resilience. She reached out and traced its edges with her finger. "It doesn't mean unclaimed anymore," she said softly. He covered her hand with his own, his touch gentle, his green eyes holding hers. "No," he agreed, a small, rare smile touching his lips. "Now it means I am home." They stood there for a long time, their hands clasped, watching the sun climb higher in the sky. There were no more words to be said. Everything they had survived, everything they had built, and everything they were about to become was held in that simple, powerful touch. Is true freedom the absence of chains, or is it the courage to stand for something, to build a home in a world that has cast you out? Perhaps the answer lies not in breaking the world to our will, but in finding the one soul who understands the language of our own. If this story resonated with you, consider subscribing for more tales that explore the wild, untamed territory of the human heart.